While crime nationwide has been on the decline, violent crime in many urban centers, in particular among communities of color, remains at unacceptably high levels. Mass incarceration, the result of the nation's enforcement focus, remains at an historic peak, nearly 8 times the level of the early 1970s. Prison expansion has been driven particularly by violent crime and drug enforcement. Violent crime enforcement accounted for 60% of the growth in the size of the U.S. state prison population from 2000 through 2008. Over 50% of people currently in federal prison are incarcerated for drug offenses. Since the late 1970s, the number of people incarcerated in state prison on drug offenses has more than tripled. The National Network for Safe Communities has shown that America can deal with these problems in a fundamentally different way. For almost 20 years, scores of jurisdictions across the country have been implementing 2 effective strategies to reduce violence, eliminate drug markets, address the historical tension between law enforcement and minority communities, and reduce the high incarceration rates in these communities. The Group Violence Reduction Strategy, first implemented as Operation Ceasefire in Boston in the mid-1990s, and the Drug Market Intervention Strategy, pioneered in High Point, North Carolina, have been implemented with remarkable success in numerous jurisdictions. The National Network brings together the jurisdictions around the country that are currently implementing these strategies, helps them address common issues and learn from each other, provides a supportive community of practice for new jurisdictions, and works to make these strategies standard practice across the United States. The National Network's current objective is to reduce the violence and over-incarceration that are destroying our most vulnerable communities and creating huge fiscal problems for our state and local governments. The National Network for Safe Communities has proven solutions to violent crime, overt drug markets, over-imprisonment, and toxic relations between law enforcement and disadvantaged communities. We can address all of these issues while helping communities to set their own standards. The National Network seeks to make its proven strategies the national standard for addressing these issues. To get there, the most important thing we need are resources and a more effective approach to public communications. We have the partnership necessary to do the work, to create a sufficient number of teaching sites to tip national practice. We have trusting relationships with a critical mass of police chiefs and law enforcement officials. We have evaluation evidence. We have the attention of relevant federal, local, and state policymakers and government executives. We have alliances with effective communities and their champions, such as the Urban League, NAACP, and the PICO Network. Solving this problem is within our reach. We are simply way under-resourced in terms of funding and staff capacity relative to the public demand for our strategies. Most of our key leverage points are already in place. We have a diverse array of cities that are committed to implementing the group violence reduction strategy to a high level of quality, to working with us to continue to improve that work, and to represent it in professional and public spheres. We have selected many of these cities with an eye to law enforcement and community leaders who are personally influential in the national conversation. Those are the core pieces necessary to create teaching sites for the rest of the country and to tip national practice. What we really need in terms of new leverage points is funding to connect other cities to these teaching sites, to support that engagement in a very intensive way, to continue to build the national community of practice, and to have a more effective public communications strategy. We have the relationships with cities, with policymakers, and with communities to do the work. We need to build the national infrastructure to spread the approach so that our proven local successes begin to have more of a national impact on violence and incarceration rates. The National Network is successful because we work in partnership with many of the best academics, police leadership, and community leaders in the country. We work in very close, sustained partnership with them, and we in turn connect them to their peers, capture and disseminate their innovations, and provide a platform to make people aware of their work. We have a long history in this role and understand how to play it effectively. We understand the community and law enforcement politics of this work. We recognize both the merits and the limits of liberal and conservative approaches to crime. We understand what the research shows actually works. We are very effective in bringing together a wide variety of partners and actually getting work done to make cities safer while putting fewer people in prison. Our organization has three key metrics of success. One key metric is successful implementation of one or both strategies in our partner cities, as measured by reductions in homicide, shootings, and incarceration. We track key indicators of implementation by city and overall outcomes. When possible, we work with outside researchers to formally evaluate the work. A second key metric is the adoption of our framework in the policy conversation on violence, crime, and incarceration. We track our presence in local and national media coverage, the federal policy conversation, and academic journals. We devote considerable energy to developing our media presence, our participation in the national policy conversation, and our body of evaluation evidence. A third key metric is simply our ability to meet the growing national demand from cities for our help. We measure this by the array of sites we are able to work with, the level of support we are able to provide, and the outcome of their city implementations. The national network strategies are often confused with the Chicago ceasefire model. We actually helped Chicago ceasefire get started in the late 1990s with what was intended to be a replication of Boston's Operation Ceasefire. In the end, Chicago ceasefire adopted the name, but only the street outreach component of the larger Boston intervention. Both field experience and formal evaluation show that standalone street outreach is rarely very effective. The public confusion around which approach is which, though, has gotten pretty serious. Another aspect of the national network that is often not understood is that our violence reduction approach is actually about using less law enforcement, about building police legitimacy, and is done in partnership with affected communities. Some have misunderstood Operation Ceasefire to be about increasing enforcement penalties for violence. It's not. The law enforcement aspect works through deterrence, not enforcement. When gangs are put on prior notice that violence will bring legal attention to the entire gang, the goal is to get compliance without having to do law enforcement. It's never completely effective, but when it works properly, it actually requires less law enforcement. We are actually saving lives right now all over the country. The operational approaches we've developed have been accepted by practitioners and are supported by a robust evaluation literature. We've gone a long way toward reframing how people think about gang and drug issues. We've defined common ground where law enforcement, communities, and even offenders can meet. We've shown that we can have both far less crime and far less imprisonment. We've shown that cities can do all this within existing resources and without waiting for legal reform or huge social investments. And we've done all this, honestly, on a shoestring. The key obstacle faced by the national network is the fact that both the work in progress in cities across the country and the demand from new cities has far outstripped our ability to keep up. Existing cities need continued support, and we need to be able to learn from their experiences. New cities need, first, startup help and then continued support. We can't do either one properly right now. Beyond that, particular areas of the strategies need stronger attention. For example, institutionalizing and sustaining the strategies has historically proven to be a challenge in some jurisdictions. Experts in police management, community organizing, and public governance could help us with this challenge, but we need the resources to find the right solutions. Many communities and policymakers are not even aware that we can address these violence and drug issues in such direct, effective ways. There's confusion about the substance of our work and the actual body of research evidence that supports it. This speaks to the need for a stronger public communications agenda. Finally, an historical challenge to our work has been the fact that it does not fit easily into the usual criminal justice conversations. It does incorporate classic prevention approaches, and it does incorporate classic enforcement approaches, but it's neither. Instead, by combining these approaches and adding the community moral voice and the focus on communication with core offenders, it becomes something quite different. But that has meant that this work hasn't fit neatly into either governmental or philanthropic funding categories. We would bring on more specialized senior staff so that we could work more intensively with our current cities and initiate startups in new cities. We would invest more heavily in peer learning between cities. We would capture and disseminate innovations, and we would advance practice in 3 key areas: institutionalization, community engagement, and reconciliation between minority communities and law enforcement. We'd invest in professional public communications to help cities, policymakers, and communities understand that we can solve these problems in the near term and educate them about how to get involved with the network and begin this work locally. Finally, we would invest in long-term development to ensure the national network is sustainable. We would bring on specialists able to work with new cities to launch the gang and drug market strategies. We'd bring on the staff that would allow us to stay in more effective contact with our partner cities. This would enhance our ability to support these sites as well as our ability to capture and disseminate local innovations. With additional resources, we could convene and work intensively with the key elements of the local partnerships: law enforcement, community figures, and service providers. We would build up a professional communications staff to produce support materials for our working partners and general information for the public.